Fleabag Season 2 is, in Fleabag's own words, a love story, but one in more ways than meets the eye. Whereas Season 1 follows Fleabag as she attempts to navigate and survive the slow, gradual degradation of her closest relationships as she actively spirals, Season 2 is centered on healing in all its numerous forms. Fleabag's most important moments throughout this journey arguably center around her finding peace with her sister and father, but there's another new and important relationship that is developed throughout the course of the season, with Fleabag gradually and unexpectedly growing to fancy a character the show only ever refers to as Hot Priest. Hot Priest is a devout Catholic that is unique amongst all other characters we encounter because he is able to recognize when Fleabag breaks the fourth wall, seeing her in arguably the most transparent manner one can. He recognizes her vulnerability and isolation and seeks to provide guidance and comfort. He asks her questions at the dinner table when he notices that nobody's spoken to her in 45 minutes, happily encourages her to debate him over their ideological differences, and confides within her intimate secrets of his own while taking care to keep hers safe. Their relationship contains the sincere, authentic sense of human connection Fleabag has craved since Season 1, and yet is tragically doomed from the beginning. But that doesn't make it any less compelling, because in the same way the priest is the only character that can see the fourth wall, Fleabag is heavily implied to be the only person that can see what happens to be haunting the priest, a fox that has followed and terrorized him throughout the course of his life. The fox is one of the show's most elusive symbols, largely because it's not used in the way that Fleabag's audience is. Whereas Fleabag's audience is used primarily to provide her comfort as a means of coping, the priest is petrified of his fox, and it appears to be a source of anguish. So, what does it mean in context of his life and the show? To start off with, let's take a look at some of the scenes in which the fox appears. In every scene with the exception of the ending, the fox appears when Fleabag and the priest are having intimate conversations. It appears for the first time when the priest fondly tells Fleabag he likes her company because she makes him question his faith, and that as a result, he has never felt closer to God. And then appears once again moments later when Fleabag comments on how she doesn't feel she can handle the celibate lifestyle of the priest, finally materializing before the both of them when the priest observes Fleabag breaking the fourth wall and sees through to her for the first time. When elaborating on this fear to Fleabag, the foxes are also specifically characterized by the priest as watching him or attempting to follow him into highly intimate settings. The bathroom, the bedroom, places where you wouldn't traditionally want to be observed, paralleling the fact that whenever he fears they are near, he and Fleabag are discussing topics they wouldn't casually want to share with just anybody. And then we've the end scene, where Fleabag and the priest finally part ways for good, and we, as the audience, are also left behind, because Fleabag no longer needs us to cope with day-to-day life. However, the fox is still there, and quietly approaches Fleabag, who points him in the priest's direction, suggesting that whatever is tormenting the priest has not been healed by this decision. Given how integral Catholicism is to the priest's identity, when attempting to analyze the fox's meaning, the first place I wanted to look was the Bible to see how foxes were used within the text. Since Season 2 is also supposed to be a love story, the book I found most fitting to research was Song of Solomon, a book uniquely centered around celebrating the union of two lovers. The verse that mentions them is 2:15, which states, "Catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that spoil the vineyards, for our vineyards are in blossom." This is a verse that correlates well with the seemingly universal image of foxes as conniving deviants, as clever and opportunistic mischief makers. Vines in Christianity are typically used to symbolize faith as something that must be nurtured and cared for before properly bearing fruit. So in this context, the fox is framed as something that corrupts and destroys faith in full bloom. It's small and seemingly benign, but its slight frame is the exact thing that confers it a powerful ability to creep about unnoticed, and must be vigilantly looked out for in order to keep this from happening. The most common interpretation of these little foxes, therefore, is that they symbolize the seemingly tiny, irrelevant behaviors, habits, or vices that boast the power to destroy one's faith or commitment to one's faith, as the vineyards in this verse are likely in reference to the lover's marriage. So within this context, the fox is representative of something that has the power to potentially destroy the priest's faith. The priest is open about his doubts, stating that he experiences them every day. So the fox could potentially represent this doubt manifesting before him in vulnerable, idle moments. Another common interpretation is that in relation to his connection with Fleabag, the fox represents the priest's long-term struggles with celibacy. The priest views sex and love as inextricably intertwined, and presumably has an extremely convoluted relationship with both, which could potentially explain a haunting struggle. Also bear in mind the tidbits of the priest's history that we do learn of. The fact that he has a sexually predatory older brother, his alcoholism, things also potentially alluding to an extremely dysfunctional relationship with both of these concepts. Given the fact the priest entered the priesthood relatively late in life, there is the possibility a big reason he entered it was due to this dysfunction. with the fox being emblematic of his fear that his struggles with celibacy will lead to the destruction of his faith, and in part, himself. Additionally, the irony that both seductive, promiscuous women and female foxes are referred to as vixens does not escape me. Fleabag perfectly embodies what many would consider to be a vixen, so if we view the fox exclusively in context of Fleabag and the priest's relationship, the fox could potentially be symbolic of the fact that although he's physically distanced himself from her, he will be followed by the impact their relationship had. We also have the interpretation that Stephen Colbert offered up in an interview with Phoebe Waller-Bridge, that the fox was a reference to The Hound of Heaven, a poem by Francis Thompson. While Phoebe Waller-Bridge admitted that wasn't the original intention, she expresses extreme fondness towards the idea, which I think makes it worth referencing. The poem follows a narrator fleeing from God in order to blindly and continuously indulge in worldly, hedonistic pleasures, essentially an inversion of the priest that we're familiar with. In the poem, to commit oneself to God is to surrender worldly pleasure, and therefore everything the narrator believes makes life worth living. However, the priest is shown to have committed himself to God fully, so why then would the fox be chasing him? If the priest is an inversion of the original narrator, then we can assume the fox is an inversion of the poem's original pursuit. Instead of being God, the fox could be the world and the desires the priest was hoping to avoid in joining the priesthood, again indicating a potential fear of sex and intimacy. However, since the priest explicitly establishes that he views sex and love as synonymous, the fox isn't just emblematic of his struggles with celibacy, but his struggles with pursuing love, a love he accuses Fleabag of attempting to avoid but that he ultimately denies himself in the end. The priest states that celibacy is simpler than sex, and therefore simpler than love, and because he fears these concepts, he denies himself both. And there's a certain tragedy to this, because aside from denying himself what many would consider to be a beautiful and natural aspect of humanity, the priest is essential in mending Fleabag's relationship with sex and love in a way he cannot do for himself. He shows her that physical and emotional intimacy are not mutually exclusive concepts, that there is nothing to fear in the pursuit of either, and that she is deserving of both, all while being incapable of accepting these things for himself. Ultimately, part of what makes the fox a fantastic symbol in my eyes is that although we can make assumptions as to what it means for the priest, a physical embodiment of past trauma, a pervasive fear of love and intimacy, something that has the capacity to destroy his faith entirely, the fox remains a mystery to us as the audience, much in the way that Fleabag's overall state of being is a mystery to the priest. The priest has snippets, but ultimately doesn't and will never know what has made her so lonely and sad, much in the way that we, as the audience, have pieces of the priest's past, but can never understand what has molded him into the person that we currently see before us. And yet, although we can never completely understand, we can still do what the priest does, which is empathize with and openly carve out a space to share that struggle in. Fleabag and the priest don't need a complete documentation of each other's lives to understand and care for the other immensely and intimately, which is why Fleabag can see the fox in the way the priest can see her audience.